broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning. This is Tracy Zimmerman. I am the Executive Director of the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation. Our organization is focused on holds up third grade reading as a proxy for child well-being. We look at children needing health and development on track beginning at birth, having supported and supportive families and communities, and high quality early learning environments. And our role in helping to bring that to fruition is really around promoting understanding about what supports children's development. We do a lot of spearheading of collaboration and bringing together cross-sector systems and advancing policy and practice. So today, our webinar is focused on a part of that, both understanding and certainly advancing policy and practice. We are truly honored to have with us two of the committee members from Transforming the Financing of Early Care and Education. We have Helen Ladd, who is the Susan B. King Professor Emerita of Public Policy and Economics at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. And for those of you in North Carolina, which most of you are, hopefully you've had the good fortune to hear Helen in a variety of settings. They've done a tremendous amount. Helen has done a tremendous amount of work, and we certainly all tout her research on our pre-K program and early learning programs in North Carolina. And Kathy Glazer, who is the president of the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, and has done tremendous work in Virginia in that role and in previous roles in advancing and building public-private partnerships to improve outcomes for young children. So it's a true honor to have them both with us today. We will spend about 45 minutes or so on their presentation, and then have 15 minutes of time for questions. You can type your questions as they're talking in the question box, and we'll moderate those at the end. And then also note that there are two handouts attached to this that provide some more background about the report. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy and Helen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. It's such an honor to have the chance to speak to your audience, so thank you for that invitation. And as always, I am really privileged to present alongside Helen Ladd, whom I may call Sony from time to time, so bear with me there. It is a real pleasure to have a chance to brief all of you today on this recent report called Transforming the Financing of Early Care and Education. The study and the report were led by able leaders and staff at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and sponsored by the agencies and organizations that are listed on the slide. Tracy, hopefully we have the study sponsors in view. Mm-hmm. And all of these fine organizations were committed to discerning a clearer vision forward for financing early care and education in the United States. And then turning next to the committee membership, just wanted to give you a chance to see who the other committee members were who deliberated, debated, and completed the report alongside Helen and myself. And it was a wonderful experience to work with such esteemed folks. Moving on to the abbreviated statement of task, just wanted to give the context that the committee had a specific charge with reviewing the available research on the resources needed to meet the true costs of high quality early care and education, and then study how to fund accessible, affordable, and high quality early care and education for all children from birth to kindergarten entry. And this is a very important point. We were charged to do that consistent with the vision that had already been outlined in the 2015 report, Transforming the Workforce for Children Birth through 8. And specifically, there were 6 questions that we were charged with trying to address, and they were as follows. First, what changes need to be made to the funding structure in order to ensure that funds are available to support quality care? How can a reasonable share of costs for families be determined? What funding mechanisms at the federal, state, and local levels have been effective in supporting the ECE workforce? What promising funding mechanisms at the federal, state, and local levels warrant further examination? What other workforce development considerations affect the effective implementation of these funding mechanisms? And last, what frameworks or tools can support national, state, and local systems to develop funding mechanisms? So, piece of cake. It's a very ambitious and dense charge, and Helen and I are pleased to be able to report to you today on some of the work that the committee accomplished. When we look at, just wanted to say a few words about some of the key terms that we use in the report and we'll use in our presentation today, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Early care and education, or as we may use the acronym ECE, because of the report's charge that was specific to financing, the committee really focused its work on paid non-parental care. And this type of ECE, of course, occurs in a range, a variety of settings that include centers, homes, and schools. And these settings also vary by type, some publicly funded, some private market-based centers or homes, while others rely on a mix of both public and private funding. Turning to the ECE workforce, we know that that's a workforce comprised of nearly 2 million practitioners working in a variety of ECE settings, and that includes both educators, and we incorporate in that lead educators, assistants, and aides, as well as administrators, coaches and mentors, etc. When we use the term financing mechanisms, we mean the method by which funds are distributed to entities. So, for example, a provider-oriented financing mechanism might include grants or contracts directly to service providers, such as through Head Start program funding or state-funded pre-K. And then family-oriented financing mechanisms would include, for example, vouchers and tax preferences. Workforce-oriented financing mechanisms may include scholarships, pay incentives, tax preferences. And then finally, systems-oriented financing mechanisms include statewide quality rating and assurance systems, as well as professional development systems. So the committee focused much of our analyses on these financing mechanisms because of the consequences they have for the accessibility, affordability, and quality of ECE programs. So the ways in which and to whom the funds are distributed can have effects on which children are served, which families benefit, and whether the care delivered is high quality, as well, of course, as affecting the well-being and qualifications of the ECE workforce. Tracy will move on to landscape of ECE financing now. So as I'm sure all callers know, the financing for early care and education in the United States is a layering of separate programs with each with very different funding streams, constituencies, eligibility requirements, quality standards, and this system then is characterized by a great deal of fragmentation across the programs and the investments. Funding from the public sector, we figure, amounts to about $29 billion, with the major public ECE programs of Early Head Start and Head Start, the Child Care and Development Fund, and of course, state-funded pre-K. The funding from private sources include those from families in the form of out-of-pocket payments, tuition and fees, as well as from philanthropy and from employers. Of these funders, families bear a heavy burden, paying about 52% of all ECE costs currently. Now shifting to principles. The committee drew from the original Transforming report on the workforce and the science of child development to establish 6 principles that could guide our work, especially as we set about judging the existing financing mechanisms that make up the current fragmented financing structure in the United States. And I'd like to, I think Tracy suggested that it might be helpful to review each of those principles with you just for some context, as well as the insights from the committee about the failures that we found in our examination of the current system regarding these 6 principles. So the first principle stated here relates to the goal of promoting a highly qualified workforce. For the workforce to be well qualified, educators and staff need to be well compensated, have affordable opportunities to access higher education, and receive appropriate ongoing support and professional development. Current failures, the various programs and financing mechanisms have been used to supplement ECE practitioners' wages, but their overall compensation is still low. And the temporary nature of these supplements doesn't create the kind of predictable and steady salaries that are necessary for ongoing recruiting and retaining of a highly qualified workforce. So that's one of the, several of the serious current failures that we noted. A notable exception to that point, though it is limited, is the practice in some state-funded pre-K programs to increase base pay through contracts with providers that set compensation levels, and we found this to be the most direct way to guarantee that ECE professionals are adequately compensated. Financial supports for ongoing professional learning and higher education for the ECE workforce are generally provided only on a limited basis, and financing is largely absent for the systems level improvements that we need to ensure that higher education programs themselves prepare students with the knowledge and competencies necessary to work with young children. And without the proper investment to make sure that there's quality in these higher education programs, financing to support the pursuit of higher education for the ECE workforce may do little to actually improve the quality of ECE professional practice. Now let's turn to Principle 2, which addresses affordability and equitable access. The current financing structure does not enable equitable and affordable access in several ways. First, families, as I mentioned before, pay approximately 52% of the total cost of ECE. Families with the lowest incomes spend about 20% of their income on ECE, while families at the highest income levels pay only about 6% of their income. Even for those families that qualify for subsidized programs, many are not receiving the assistance that they need due to inadequate funding of those programs. The financing mechanisms, too, are not harmonized. Head Start state child care assistance programs and state-funded pre-K programs tend to target resources to low-income families, while tax preferences, a different financing mechanism, benefit middle and upper-income families. This lack of harmonization leads to gaps in ECE affordability for low-income families and to underutilization by middle-income families. I think that's it for Principle 2. So moving on to Principle 3. When we look at provider-oriented and family-oriented mechanisms, they have the potential to promote quality. However, the existing quality standards and the effectiveness of their implementation vary across financing mechanisms and across programs. So typically the receipt of funding is not directly linked to attaining or maintaining quality standards and does not offer the incentives that are needed for attaining and sustaining high quality early care and education. Levels of support that are directed to providers and to families are rarely based on the actual cost of offering high quality ECE services, and therefore aren't sufficient when we look at really wanting to drive quality improvements across the system. Many providers lack secure funding that would allow them to maintain the stable operations and to invest in these quality improvements. The next slide gives a sense of principles number 4 and number 5. So in working to ensure service delivery options that are of high quality and financially sustainable, the committee considered the viability of both provider-oriented and family-oriented financing mechanisms and also reckoned with the potential trade-offs that are involved. Most of the provider-oriented financing is currently directed to center-based providers, um, offering care during non-standard hours, for example, is generally not cost efficient for most centers, so that families who need care during these hours may find it difficult to secure affordable quality care that meets their needs. Provider-oriented financing could, however, incentivize providers to offer services during non-standard hours. Another example, similarly, provider-oriented financing varies in the duration of services that are supported, but could be supported with adequate funding to require or incentivize providers to offer services for longer periods of time that better meet the need of some working parents. While family-oriented mechanisms give families options regarding program location, hours of operation, and importantly, approaches to child development, this choice could be restricted in terms of terms set by the program. And families may choose to purchase care that is really based on their convenience in terms of location, and that convenience could come at the expense of choosing quality programs for children's well-being and optimal development. With Principle 5, building and upgrading facilities are often overlooked elements of a quality infrastructure for early care and education. And ECE providers need funds for acquiring new facilities and also maintaining, expanding, and improving existing facilities. There are several provider-oriented and family-oriented mechanisms that support ECE facilities, including loans, grants, tax credits, community development financial institutions, yet without a really consistent and effective financing system for these physical infrastructure improvements, providers are forced to pursue piecemeal financing approaches, and these are often insufficient to meet the need. Currently, we found no system-wide approach that existed for providing the support for building and improving ECE facilities. And lastly, Principle 6, improving the quality of ECE also requires a robust and coordinated system of data collection and management, monitoring, and assurance and improvement systems. This system must include the components of data collection and management systems, licensing, monitoring, regulation, and accountability and improvement systems. Currently, the financing supports for this type of system-wide quality improvement are limited and often not sustained, so may come about in sort of temporary initiatives. Resources for quality improvements within the existing funding streams are not specifically earmarked for quality improvement or are provided or are not provided at high enough levels to really effectively incentivize and promote and sustain quality. Quality rating improvement systems are commonly used across states, but these systems vary greatly between states and are limited in their capacity to support and reward workforce supports for developing a highly qualified workforce. Now I'm going to turn it over to Helen to discuss cost and cost estimates.
Right. So if we could go to the next slide, the outline for the remainder. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about our findings. We have three parts for the rest of this presentation. We present our illustrative cost estimate, which is a nationwide estimate of the cost. And then we have 10 recommendations. I'll talk about 5 of them, and Kathy will come back and talk about 6 through 10. And Kathy will end with some key messages. So let's move right ahead. The cost calculation is complicated because what we're trying to do with our illustrative cost estimate is to cost out what would be required to meet all the 6 principles that Kathy just talked about. So we had to include lots of different components. We have lots of on-site costs. The 2 most important are the 2 at the top of the list, the staffing levels and structures, and the staff qualifications and compensation, because compensation accounts for a large component of the cost. So we had to make assumptions about those, and I'll tell you more shortly. But we also had to include on-site professional responsibilities, assumptions about operating hours and days, and then also assumptions about facilities, costs, and other non-personnel costs. But in addition to the on-site cost, we included in our cost estimation system level costs. And this includes the costs of developing the workforce and costs of quality assurance and improvement costs. So let's jump right in. As we were making our cost estimates, as Kathy said, we are building on the Transforming the Workforce report that came out in 2015. And there were some key assumptions in that we built on. One is that lead educators should have a BA degree, at least by the time that the programs are fully implemented. There should be resources for coaching and mentoring, paid release time for professional development. We should have specialists for children with special needs, and there should be paid contact time when the educators are in the centers or family care centers, but not directly working with children. So these are the assumptions that come out of that workforce report that we're building on as we go forward. So let's go to the next slide. So we ended up making 2 sets of cost estimates. One is a static estimate, and that has the advantage that it's based on current usage patterns, and we have data on current usage patterns. But we're ultimately most interested in the dynamic estimates, where we take the current usage patterns, but we project or expected usage, because we think usage in various categories will change as we increase the accessibility and lower the cost to families of early care and education. We also, in our cost estimate, have a 4-phase transition process. The importance of phasing it in comes about because, or it just reflects the fact that we're promoting big changes in the workforce and other elements of ECE. And we understand that they can't happen immediately. So we built in a 4-phase transition process. And all the numbers I'm going to give you are in 2016 dollars. When we drew on existing costs of various types, we inflated those up. If they were from an earlier year, we inflated them to 2016. And then going forward, everything's in 2016 dollars, so we do not incorporate inflation. Let's go to the next slide. So I hope this won't overwhelm you. This is just to give you a sense of how our cost estimating process works. Start in the left-hand corner box. We start with data on current hours of ECE used by family income group, by age of child, and by type, center versus home-based. The committee hired a consultant to work with the National Survey of Early Care and Education data to come up with that information. And then as you move to the right on that top line, we multiplied those hours that we came up with times an hourly cost. Now this is at the national level. And so we're using national cost. We incorporate into that cost by age of child and type of ECE. And then we come up with a static estimate. So I'm in the top right-hand box now, and it's the cost estimate by age of child, type of ECE, and family income. That's a gross, and we incorporate all the other elements that I talked about earlier, like workforce development costs and system level costs. We come up with a gross estimate of the cost. And then from that, we subtract an estimate of family payments, which is a percent of income by group in our illustrative example, to come up with a net subsidy cost. So that's our static estimate. If you can now go back to the left-hand side of this figure again and just look at the arrow going down, the big change as we move to a dynamic cost estimate is that we adjust the current hours. We start with the current hours, ECE, for age and income groups, but then we adjust them. And we adjust them in three ways. As a result of the changes in the workforce and the quality and accessibility, we think the percent of children in paid early care and education will go up. We think average hours per week are likely to go up. And we also think there will be a shift from home-based to center-based care. So once we bring in those adjusted usage numbers, then we go across the system again. We multiply that by the hourly cost, by age of child and type of ECE, and we come up with a dynamic cost estimate. And again, we have a gross estimate, and then we're going to subtract payments. So let's go to this estimated total cost of a high quality ECE system. I draw your attention to the right-hand column, which is the total costs, annual costs by phase 4 after everything is phased in. So the key number there is that top one, the total dynamic estimate, because that's the one we prefer, is about $140 billion in 2016 dollars. And of that, about 105 billion would be center-based and 34 would be home-based. If you look at the bottom of that column, you'll see by phase 4, the center-based care, we project to be about 75%, to account for 75% of the cost, and home-based 25%. Now, if you go back to the left at the bottom there, you'll see that over time, there are changes in the reliance on center-based versus home-based. So center-based care started out in phase 1, which is very close, but a somewhat improvement from the current system, with 67% of the cost on center-based, and by the time you get to phase 4, it's 75%. For home-based, the pattern goes in the other direction, 33% down to 25%. And that's because of our assumptions that are based on some econometric evidence about our expected use of the two types of services. Let's go to the next slide. So we had $140 billion. That's the number that, the key number to keep in your head. That sounds like a huge number, and it is, but if we're trying to put it into perspective in this slide, this cost relative to gross domestic product in the US in phase 1 would be about 0.4% of GDP. By phase 4, that's the $140 billion cost, that's about 0.75% of current GDP. And that's a high percentage relative to the present, but it's still somewhat lower than the average for OECD countries, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So it's not, it's not completely out of the ballpark. And the other way to put the EC costs in perspective is to look at them relative to K through 12 spending. By phase 4, we project that the costs of early care and education would be about 22% of total K through 12 expenditures. Given those expenditures go from age 6 to 18, and we're talking about costs for 0 to 5, again, that percentage seems reasonable to us. Let's go to the next slide. This is the slide labeled sharing the costs. We spent a lot of time on the committee trying to figure out how much of this total cost would be a reasonable amount or share for families to pay. And in one of the appendices to the report, we go through a number of different possible options, including having families pay no fee at all, as is the case for K through 12 education. But we ended up using for our illustrative example an assumption that families would make reasonable payments for ECA, but that the ECE, but that these payments would increase progressively with income. So family payments at the lowest income level would be reduced to zero, so they would be, the services would be free. And then as a share of payments, the family payments as a share of family income would increase progressively as income rises. And then the burden for families with income, well, actually this last point sets the level of everything. We, for the purposes of our illustrative example, we set the burden for families with income between 2 to 3 times the federal poverty level at 10%, which is the current median payment for this group. So 10% is for that group, and then lower income families would pay a lower share, and higher income families would pay up 12 to 15% under this illustrative cost estimate and distribution. Let's go on to the next slide. So now I'm back at the top of this slide is what you saw before, and we've got the $140 billion total dynamic cost. And now you can see how the family payments changing over time, or what it is, and how it's changing over time. And then what's not paid by the families are paid through public or private assistance. So Kathy talked about the various elements there. It's all the financing mechanisms through the public sector, plus some perhaps through private employers. So if you look at the bottom, you can see, according to our illustrative estimate, and this is just illustrative, the family payments would fall in phase 1 from 55% of the total cost down to 42% by the time everything is phased in, and the public-private assistance would go from 45% to 58%. Next slide. So this just tells us how we're going to fill the gap, or no, it doesn't tell us how we're going to do it. It tells it reports what we need to fill the gap. So go over to the far right-hand column again in phase 4. We have 140 billion. That's the number at the top, and we've got, if you subtract out the family payment, we then get to 81 billion in the public-private assistance row. But we're currently spending, as Kathy mentioned, $29 billion per year. So if you take that 81 or $82 billion and subtract 29, you get the number in that far right-hand corner, which is $53 billion. And that's a number that's increasing dramatically over time as we phase in toward the final goal of having an ECE system that fully meets the principles that Kathy spelled out. So let's go to the next slide. I want to turn now to the recommendations. So those are all our illustrative cost estimates, but those aren't our recommendations. Those are just trying to get a sense of what's needed in order to have early care and education system that fully meets the quality standards of care and of the workforce that are set out. So we've got 10 recommendations. The first 3 I'll talk about are deal with setting up a structure for financing. Recommendations 4 and 5 relate to sharing the cost, and then Kathy will come back in and talk about the other 5 before we turn to key messages. So let's go on to the first recommendation. central to all of this is high quality. And so we think it's important for the federal and state governments to establish consistent standards that are consistent with the goal of high quality care provided by a high quality and well compensated workforce. And then if we're going to, so they need to somehow do that. And we envision the federal government playing a role and perhaps being the policy lever that will push some of the states toward these consistent standards. But we also understand that many states may be ahead of the federal government, and there's nothing in this that keeps states from not having higher standards than the ones that are consistent with the federal programs. But a key here is that the funding then should be linked to standards. So if funding is going to go to providers, if it's a provider-oriented mechanism, that funding should be linked to the standards, because the idea is eventually to have all programs meet high standards. And funding should be sufficient to cover the costs of high-quality ECE. So in a moment, you'll see there's the family share, but then there needs to be other supports to make sure that the providers can provide high quality care. Let's go to recommendation 2. Recommendation 2, not surprisingly, given the principles that we talked about earlier, is to promote access for all children to high quality care. Now, the committee discussed a lot whether care should be available based on parental employment, and we argued no, it should not be contingent on parental employment, because a major goal of improved ECE, it relates to the goal of high quality child development. We think federal and state governments should set uniform progressive family payment standards, not specifically the ones, that we used in our illustrative example, but nonetheless progressive family payment standards consistent with those. And then the costs not covered by family payment should be covered by direct support to providers and assistance to families. Let's go to recommendation 3. This is complicated. State aid, the whole system is complicated. Our recommendation 3 is that state agencies should act as coordinators. Now, notice we've written here that this is going to be most applicable to states that have already demonstrated a willingness to implement a high quality ECE system by setting high standards and by their willingness to provide additional funding. For such states, we think the state agencies should act as coordinators for the state and federal financing mechanism, with the goal of simplifying the system so all providers are facing the same standards. Let's go to recommendation 4. 4 and 5. So sharing the cost. First recommendation relates to the conclusion that by phase 4, we're going to have a lot of additional costs that are going to have to come out of either public or private assistance to families. And so the recommendation is simply that the federal and state government should increase funding levels, and they also need to revise tax preferences, which is one way to assist the families. I noted here that we do envision a significant ongoing role for the federal government, but I perhaps should have added to that line that there will also have to be a significant financing role at the state and local government level as well. We do not spell out in the report specific revenue sources to be used to meet this federal and state responsibility, but we do discuss that, or we do argue that any new revenue sources should meet standard criteria for a good tax, such as fairness and progressivity, stability, and revenue raising potential. And then finally, recommendation 5 relates to what I was talking about earlier with the illustrative example. Family payments for families at the lowest income level should be reduced to 0. And if a family contribution is required by a program, that contribution as a share of family income should progressively increase as income rises. That's the assumption we made in our illustrative example, and the levels might be different here and may differ across states, but that's the basic principle and recommendation. So let me turn back to Kathy, who's got about 6 minutes.
Woohoo!
Schedule.
Let's see if I can speed through this. Thank you. So turning to recommendation 6, which focuses on planning for this transition to high quality. We recognize that this process of transitioning will take time, extensive resources, and very intentional coordination and planning. The non-parental private sector, and specifically businesses, employers, and philanthropic organizations, should work with public funders and other key stakeholders, including both national and statewide coordinating bodies, as well as any interested parent, provider, and ECE workforce representatives, to develop and implement national, state, and local level strategic business plans to guide the transition toward this reformed financing structure that we've envisioned for high quality ECE, with a specific emphasis on the business, financial, and systems strategies. Moving on to recommendations 7 and 8. These are specifically focused on the financing, the workforce transformation, and strengthening both the incumbent and the future ECE workforce. Given the ECE workforce's low levels of compensation, we recognize that asking these professionals to contribute out of pocket to their educational expenses or to cover them using loans that must be repaid with future wages is not feasible during this transition period to high quality. We believe that the incumbent ECE workforce shouldn't bear any cost to increase their knowledge base. The entering workforce should be assisted to limit their costs to a reasonable proportion of their postgraduate earnings, with the goal of maintaining and further promoting the diversity of the ECE professionals. There are a number of grant-based resources for higher education that are currently available from a variety of sources, and we believe those resources should be leveraged to offset the cost, the extensive cost of tuition and fees for these professionals pursuing higher education. We recognize that additional funding is likely going to be necessary to ensure that these professionals are able to pursue higher education and any other types of credentialing at an affordable rate. We believe that states and localities should work together with colleges and universities to provide the additional resources, and especially directed to the incumbent workforce as they pursue these additional qualifications. Recommendation 8 focuses on improving the quality, too, of professional programs for the ECE workforce. States and federal government should provide, we believe, grants to institutions and systems of post-secondary education to develop the faculty and the ECE programs, and to also, importantly, align the ECE curricula with the science of child development and early learning, and with the principles of high-quality professional practice for working with and teaching very young children. The federal funding should be leveraged through grants that would provide incentives to states, to colleges and universities to ensure that their higher education programs are of high quality and aligned with workforce needs, including evaluating and monitoring student outcomes, curricula, and processes. Now shifting to recommendations 9 and 10, when we are thinking about ongoing assessment of our progress toward quality. The committee acknowledges that we don't have all of the answers, and in really striving toward achieving this goal of affordable, high quality ECE for all children, it's going to be very important to track the efforts over this transition period and examine results along the way. We believe that research and data collection are going to be critical to helping realize this system that we've envisioned. We think that federal and state governments, as well as other funders, should provide sustained funding for research and evaluation on ECE to ensure that the efforts to improve the system are actually resulting in the positive outcomes for children that we're striving for, and to the recruitment and retention of a highly qualified and diverse workforce. And recommendation 10, we believe the federal government should align its data collection requirements across all the diverse federal ECE funding streams in order to be able to collect comprehensive information about the entire, very varied ECE sector, and to be able to sustain investments in regular national data collection efforts from both state and nationally representative samples that can track the changes in the ECE landscape over time, and therefore to help us better understand the experiences of ECE programs, the workforce itself, and of course, the developmental outcomes of children. Now let's turn quickly to key messages that we want to leave you with. So again, consistent with the initial transforming report, as well as the principles that we described earlier, the committee worked hard to lay out a vision for financing early care and education. And we believe that collectively these 10 recommendations represent a pretty solid framework for using financing to bring about accessible, affordable, and high quality ECE systems. So in sum, high quality ECE is critical to positive child development and has the potential, of course, to generate economic returns which benefit not only the children and their families, but also society at large. Currently, only a small share of children have access to such high quality programs because the cost of providing this access far exceeds the current funding amounts that are available. The majority of families, of children and families choosing to use ECE services are in low or mediocre quality programs that just simply don't have the resources necessary to support the optimal development for the children in their care. There are also a substantial number of children whose families would like to participate in early care and education services but are unable to, either because of a lack of resources or a lack of availability in their communities. We find that the current financing mechanisms tend to treat each component of ECE, service delivery, system supports, and workforce supports as separate systems or separate components, rather than parts of one integrated system, and that they do not adequately promote or incentivize high quality ECE options. We also are concerned that the disjointed structure places a heavy administrative burden on providers, and is inadequate to reward and professionally support the early childhood workforce. And then our final thoughts are that reliable, accessible, high quality ECE for young children from birth to kindergarten entry, which includes, of course, a highly qualified and adequately compensated workforce, can be achieved. We do believe this is possible. And we also acknowledge that there's great urgency in beginning the process, the work to realize this vision. We recommend that this can be accomplished largely through greater harmonization and coordination among multiple funding mechanisms and revenue streams, and through greater uniformity in the standards to incentivize quality. It will, of course, require significant mobilization of financial and other resources shared across both the public and private sectors, including a more equitable distribution of share from family contributions, and that important commitment to major increases in public investment. We believe that for too long, the nation has been making do with ECE policies and systems that were known to be broken. And we hope that our report will stimulate discussion and leadership and commitment among many stakeholders to plan and implement this transformed system that we've envisioned here. Once in place, we believe the structure can realize the creation of a self-perpetuating cycle of excellence that will attract and retain high-quality professionals, will serve the needs of all families, and allow the nation to do what is right to get our very youngest citizens off to the best possible start in life. I think if there's time, Tracy, Helen, and I would be glad to hear any questions that your audience has.
Thank you both so much for sharing all of this information with us. As a reminder to folks who are participating, if you type your question in the question box, I will be able to share that over the next 8 minutes or so with Helen and Kathy. So we do have one, which is really looking at the role of sort of the return on investment. So this person is writing that, there's ample evidence that public funds invested in these programs return a substantial percentage of that investment to the public, in the form of downstream savings on special education and criminal justice, et cetera. And so should these be factored into thinking about what the financing actually is? That's the first part of the question. I'll keep going if you want to take that on first.
So just a quick answer to that. Certainly having a high rate of return on investment is important for promoting all the things that the committee is supporting and recommending is done. So I'm not sure how that directly affects the sharing of the costs or whatever, but it's an essential part of the story to lead people forward on this important issue.
Okay. And the follow-up to that is, and I'm not sure how much work has been done looking at this, but do the dollars paid by families return a percentage to those families, or is the return on investment only realized by governments that appropriate funds?
Oh, it's a return to everybody.
Right.
There's a collective interest in having high quality ECE. So there are benefits to the individual families, but it's very important to realize that there's a collective interest for a lot of the reasons Kathy mentioned in promoting high quality ECE. And there may be a moral reason as well, which we don't talk about in the report. The science of child development just emphasizes how important early development is for individual children. And we all know that education is very important for the life chances of individuals. So from a distributional point of view, it's extremely important, I would argue, to make sure we provide high quality ECE to all children.
On the slide that was putting the cost in context, and it referenced the percentage of funds, how it related to expenditures on K-12. Were those federal expenditures or total expenditures across state and federal?
Total expenditures.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. And under Principle 2, can you talk more about programs not being harmonized?
Sure, I'll try to tackle that, and then Helen, if you want to add something. So I think the harmonization that we were thinking about is, there are a couple of different ways, I think, to think about it. In Principle 2, I think we were thinking specifically about the financing mechanisms, and so the sort of the basis or the purpose of some of the financing mechanisms being specifically focused on children who are from low-income families, and the kind of trade-off of the financing mechanisms that really benefit more the middle to higher income families. So it's really trying to grapple with thinking about how to make sure that we're not creating more of a gap. There's sort of another sense of harmonizing some of the programs later in terms of really making sure that the revenue streams continue from the existing programs like Head Start, CCDF, et cetera, and that they are able to be blended or coordinated at more efficiently and effectively at the state level.
And the only thing I would add is the data about current systems is pretty clear that, you know, a lot of ECE programs do an okay job of making ECE accessible for very low income families, but there's a gap for middle income families because they don't have enough, they have too much money to qualify for things like Head Start, but they don't have enough money to benefit from tax breaks or other family assistance types of programs. So we're trying to harmonize to make sure that there's a continuity in access to high quality services across income groups.
Great. So this person is talking about they're trying to project costs for universal high quality program for 4-year-olds in a large urban area. Is any of the data you presented segmented by age?
All of our analysis was by age group. So there's, if you look at the report, you'll see lots of estimates for infants who are very expensive, or the services for them are very expensive because of, and then for toddlers, and then for pre-K. So yes, there are those components. So I think there would be some useful information in the report for the question.
Helen, I would point out in particular in Chapter 6, there's a table 6.4 that breaks down those costs in those particular age group, and these are separated by pre-kindergartners age 3 to 5, toddlers age 12 to 36 months, and infants under 12, and phasing through the 4 transition phases. So that may be useful in terms of thinking about an estimated cost per child in those age groups.
So can you both speak as a follow-up to that question? While this is intended to generate, as you said, a larger conversation and thinking about how do you implement this, are there ways that states and even communities could be using this report in either practical ways as they're thinking about local financing for programs for young children, or into thinking about state policy?
Kathy, I'll let you start with that.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think there are 2 particular ways, and they're based on 2 specific recommendations in the report. One is to really focus on this opportunity to think about coordination at the state level, and that can either be our report, I think, designated either a state agency, a public sector entity, or a public-private or an intermediary organization at the state level that can assist with that, tricky job of the financing, of really weaving and leveraging the financing of these different funding streams to be able to be available to the state for its systems development. The other piece is the recommendation around developing business plans. I think that states can already really think about bringing stakeholders together to figure out how states can set priorities, can set their goals and targets for developing such a system, and go ahead and begin to think about what kind of a business plan it would take for their state to really move forward. We think that in that case that likely the national level business plan may come first, but then very quickly thereafter, states will be able to, I think, really follow on and bring that sort of leadership and vision to the state level.
And the only other thing I would add, just because we haven't emphasized it in our talk today, is the important role of the business community itself. We do not envision them, the private sector business community, as big funders of ECE, although in some big employers, may well be able to add some funding. But we do view them as very important stakeholders in this, and a group that can and should be mobilized in a lot of local and state areas.
Great. Well, I know we're at 11 o'clock. While there are more questions, I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. But want to again thank you both, Helen and Kathy, for sharing this information. And to all of you who participated, you will receive a link with a recording of the webinar. And I did hear in some comments back that there were some problems with the handout. So I will send the links to those as well as a link to a PDF of the presentation. So again, thank you all and have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Bye-bye.